Hello and welcome back to the workshop. Where we left off last, we put the top on, we shaped it. We've got a guitar shape. Now before I get too far into it, I want to line things up. So today we're going to work on the fretboard. And I've got some interesting ideas for that. So as I said at the end of the last one, I'm going to use these pieces of scrap. I've got a couple more if I need to fill in the blanks. But what I'm going to do, years ago I saw a checkerboard fretboard and I really liked that idea and I never moved forward with doing anything with it. And then I watched Ben Crow's 2077 guitar and I saw what he did with those scraps of ebony and I thought the great guitar Buildoff is a perfect spot to do this at. So instead of doing the checkerboard, I'm going to do strips. So you see I've got some scrap maple and some scrap granadillo, albeit they're two different thicknesses. So first I'm going to address getting this down to thickness, and then I'm going to cut these into strips, and we're going to piece together a fretboard. So with that being said, let's jump into it. I'm going to go cut these into pieces, and we'll get into what I'm going to do with this. Alright, this is what we're going for. So very basically I've cut these down into strips. So I'm going to cut these into about 2-inch strips, and then I'm just going to build up the fretboard from there. And I'm going to cut that down using a shooting board and a stop block so that I can consistently cut the same every time. So now that we have all these cut up, you can kind of see what I'm going for here. I'm going to be joining these up about halfway up each of them, and then I'm going to alternate. So in the same fashion as with cutting these, I'm going to use this board because I know that it's square, and I'm just going to take my leveling beam and square up these edges. And then I'm going to do that in roughly another 50 some odd times. But you don't need to see that. Making a fretboard, making a fretboard, making a fretboard. Hey Miles, we can just use this fretboard. But then what do I do with all these scraps? At least you gathered them up. Now I've done a boatload of sanding and I decided to test a little bit of it. So I found that the easiest way to go about this is to do a couple rows at a time and keep it clamped flat to my bench so that hopefully I can reduce the amount of sanding that I have to do later. Obviously I'm still going to have to sand it flat, but I want to minimize how much of that I have to do. And that way, I've left it real thick so that I can then get it down to final thickness and radius it. So, I'm going to keep cracking on, and we'll get this fretboard all glued together. So this method seems to be working great. I'm on another batch of the rows here. I'd say I'm about 7.5 rows in, which is a little more than half the fretboard. So I've been gluing up a couple segments and then moving along, and while I've been doing that, I've been cleaning out these sound holes, just taking these needle files and cleaning away at it. So I'm going to keep cracking at it, and we'll come back when I'm closer to done. Alright, we got the whole thing glued together. And I've gone ahead and flattened one of these sides. Now I noticed because the grain is going in all different directions. I was hand planing it wanted to tear out. To avoid that, that switched to a lot of hand sanding. So normally when I do a radius on my fretboard, I'll hand plane it first, and then I'll go with a sanding block to get it the rest of the way there. In this case, because of the grain, I think I'm going to play it safe here, and I've set up this routing jig here. Now very simply, all this does is it slides across this middle beam here, and it allows me to tip it back and forth to get that 14-inch radius that I'm looking for. So I'm going to use Ben's favorite super glue and masking tape trick to put this down on the board, and I'm going to plane the radius onto it. As you can see, I'm about halfway there. I'm taking small passes to make sure that I don't take too much off at the same time and trying to keep it as even as possible. Obviously, I'm going to go back and clean this out, so it's not going to matter a whole lot in the end. But I'm going to keep at it. Alright, there you have it. There's the finalized radius board. So I'm going to pull this off, clean it up, and get it marked out to where I need to cut off to make the length of the board. So now I've got the fretboard radius. As you can see, it's a little thinner than normal, and I did that on purpose because I want to take and laminate it on top of another board just to add some strength into these joints. So I want to end up at about between a 6 and an 8 millimeter thickness altogether. So first, I'm going to plane this down to about 4 millimeters, take a couple strips off for the binding, and then I'm going to plane it down the rest of the way, and then that'll give us the board to laminate it onto. Now I've had to take a step back, if you can't tell by my face. My body decided to have an immunoresponse to something, so while the meds kick in, I'm not going to be doing a whole lot. So I figured this weekend I'll at least get this part finished up so that I can continue going once this all finally clears up. And with that, we'll come right back once I plane this board down. Alright, I've got it planed down. It's at about 3 millimeters. So overall, that gives me just over 8 millimeters, which gives me a place to sand. I'm doing this for stability purposes to try and hold these segments together better so that it'll give it more surface area across it with the glue joints. My hopes is that it'll make this fretboard real strong so that these parts don't start delaminating. Now, I know the color difference here, which is why I plan on binding it all the way around. That way you won't see the separation. And of course I went with more of the Granadello just to go with the same color scheme that is already on the fretboard. Now if you can't tell, I've already cut a couple of the slots here just so that I know where my board is starting and ending. And then I've got the 12th one marked too, that way I can get all the frets laid out. And if you can't tell, I'm doing a fan fret. Alright, let's get this glued up. Now I'm not worrying too much about any of the squeeze out for two reasons. One, I want that to be sure to fill any of the voids that is left in those segmented pieces. And two, I'm going to be cutting off the excess anyway. So I'm going to let that dry up. It's going to have a good long time to cure. And when we come back, we'll slot it and cut it to shape. So this turned out great. It seems that laminating it was the way to go. This feels far more stable, and I could see just as I was gluing up that there were some voids where the glue came through. So that also helped fill in those spaces. So what's next is I got to cut the fret slots. You see I already started where the nut is going to go, and the 12th fret, and then the 24th fret, just so I can get the dimensions of my neck. So what's next is I'm going to mark those out. I'm going to slice them up, and then I'm going to square off all these edges so that I can put the binding on. And to do that, I'm going to use this Crimson Guitars fret ruler. We're going to do a 25.5 on the low end, and then we're going to do a 24.75 scale on the high end. Alright, I'm looking pretty spot on both ends here. So I think we're good to start slicing. Now I want to do as much of this in my fretting jig as possible. That gets a little complicated when you start doing fan frets, because you have to be able to angle it. So I notice already that in these upper frets I'm not going to be able to use this. But we're going to try and start with as many of these as possible, and then I'll finish off the rest by hand. I just want to make sure they're as square as possible before I start getting into gluing on the binding or putting any of the frets in. Now before I get too crazy with sanding everything to depth, I want to line everything up, because I want to be able to route my cavities before I put the fretboard on. So thankfully my bridges showed up. Now like I said, we're doing a fan fret, so my bridges are going to land somewhere around here, but I'm using this as an excuse to try out these lace pickups. I've been intrigued by them for years now, and so I think I'm going to do a humbucker and 2 single coils. Now the way I want to lay this out is I want to, one, follow the angle of my fretboard for the top one. So roughly in about here, and one right in the center. Now when I originally did this body design, I'm really big on humbucker pickups, so this is designed for 2 humbuckers, but I think this gives me just enough room to put the 3 pickups in here. So I'm looking at my routing templates, and at first I was thinking going with a traditional hole, because I don't want to put any cover plates on here. But after going through it, I don't like the look of that too much. It's going to make a really big pocket, and then those pockets are going to be real close to each other. So I think I'm going to have to go ahead and make my own template. So I'm just going to take this top template here for a single coil with a cover, and I'm going to modify it so that it's long enough for the pickup to sit in. So this one is just long enough, but it's square. So I'm going to trace this one and then trace the rounded corners on, and then make a new template so that I can put the pockets in the body. And the key is to make these look as clean as possible so that I don't require any type of cover on here. There's something satisfying about making a jig with another jig. Or maybe that's just me. After all that, you got yourself a pretty clean pocket, and I can go ahead and do the other 2. And after all is said and done, you should end up with something just like this. Alright, I've now cleaned up my mess from routing. If there's one piece of advice that I can give at all, which I'm not the greatest at, make sure to clean up after yourself as frequently and often as you can. it just makes things go so much easier. So I found the flattest part of my bench here that I could find, and I went ahead and did the super glue and masking tape trick so that I could get this flat to my bench so that I can flatten it out. I want to take off about 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters total from the top. So I'm going to start by using my flat sanding beam here, and then I'm going to switch over to the radius block to put the radius on. Alright, now that I've gone through, I'm looking pretty flat and true. I have widened my fret slots here. Obviously I'm going to do another round of sanding after this, but for now I'm going to get the binding glued on. So as you can see, I just slightly undercut where the binding goes so that I can finish putting on that radius on the rest of the binding. Alright, we got the binding on, we got it nice and straight. I've double and triple checked. Now that I got it to this point, we're just about ready to put it on the neck. I don't want to do any inlays because there's already a lot going on the fretboard, but I do want markers, so I'm going to address side dots that are going to overhang on this binding here. And I think to do that, I'm going to inlay these thin strips of maple as a side dot so that they also kind of show on the top here. Now that we got this far, I think we're going to leave it here for now until the next episode. We'll get it glued on to the neck, we'll get the back glued on, and we'll start shaping the neck. If you haven't been following along until now, go ahead and go watch the other videos. There's a link up above here where you can go and watch that playlist. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.